Hello, everyone. This is lesson 31, lecture 3, where we are taking a little bit of a detour in preparation for the video that you're going to watch for the following class. And we are going to talk a little bit about a very unique archaeological site from Italy, which is known as Pompeii. And the first, and in some sense, the most important thing to remember about Pompeii is how you spell the name of the city. So it might look a little bit like the name of that famous general, Pompey, but instead it's spelled with two I's. That's not a misspelling at the end. So just keep remembering that so you don't confuse the two. At any rate, this is a Roman city. So here we are in Italy. You might recall the city of Naples, right? That's sort of south of Rome. And it is in this neighborhood that the Mount Vesuvius erupted right here. You can see it erupted in the year 79 CE and led to the destruction of the whole town of Pompeii. And I think that this is one of the most important archaeological sites in the ancient world because essentially the lava functioned as a protection for recording life exactly as it was on that particular day in Pompeii. People were aware, as you can sort of suspect, that this was happening. So it's not quite a snapshot of a normal daily life kind of scene, but maybe people fleeing or something like that. But nevertheless, the point is that we have an ancient city preserved unusually well. And that's why people are still visiting it today, or I'm sure they will after this is over, and also why archaeologists love the site. So again, here we are, and so here's Mount Vesuvius, and here is the city of Pompeii. Additionally, in addition to the archaeological references about which we are going to talk a little bit later, and then you will see much more of that in the video, in addition, we also have literary evidence. We have texts surviving about this eruption. And the most important of that is by Pliny the Younger. And there were two Plinies. There's Pliny the Younger and Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder was the uncle. And his nephew, Pliny the Younger, later on wrote to the historian Tacitus, describing the final days of his uncle with the hope that Pliny the Elder would be making an appearance in Tacitus's historical works. And so we do have two letters from Pliny giving us details about how this all unfolded. So let's take a quick look and see what we can learn here. So Pliny the Elder, this is the Younger talking to Tacitus, was at Misenum in his capacity as commander of the fleet on the 24th of August, right? So here, just 1 second, let's look at this. So right here in Misenum was a very important naval port for the Romans, and that's where Pliny the Elder was as a commander of the fleet. And then so on the 24th of August, between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, my mother drew his attention to a cloud of unusual size and appearance. Okay, so that's what we are talking about, right? This is kind of looking like a cloud, but of course, we have much better science training than they did. But so let's see what happened. He had had a sun bath, then a cold bath, and was reclining after dinner with his books. He called for his shoes when he heard about this and climbed up to where he could get the best view of the phenomenon. The cloud was rising from a mountain at such a distance we couldn't tell which, but afterwards learned that it was Vesuvius. I can best describe its shape by likening it to a pine tree. It rose into the sky on a very long trunk from which spread some branches. I imagine it had been raised by a sudden blast, which then weakened, leaving the cloud unsupported so that its own weight caused it to spread sideways. Some of the cloud was white. In other parts, there were dark patches of dirt and ash. The sight of it made the scientist in my uncle determined to see it from closer at hand. So we see here how elite men are typically supposed to behave, in addition to being, military person. Pliny the Elder also felt that as a smart, educated person, he wanted to know what this was and how this was unfolding. And so when he says he wanted to see it closer at hand, he actually took a boat and tried to go to this area of the shore closer essentially to the eruption. You might be screaming right now, don't do it, Pliny the Elder, but he did it. And so that's what we will find out about. It didn't end well, as the title suggests. Anyways, this is what Pliny the Younger said. They tied pillows on the top of their heads once they reached that part of the shore as protection against the shower of rock. It was daylight now elsewhere in the world, but there the darkness was darker and thicker than any night. But they had torches and other lights. They decided to go down to the shore to see from close up if anything was possible by sea. Now they realized they should be running. But it remained as rough and uncooperative as before. Resting in the shade of a sail, he drank once or twice from the cold water he had asked for. Then came a smell of sulfur, announcing the flames and the flames themselves, sending others into flight, but reviving him. Supported by 2 small slaves, he stood up and immediately collapsed. As I understand it, his breathing was obstructed by the dust-laden air, and his innards, which were never strong and often blocked or upset, simply shut down. When daylight came again, 2 days after he died, his body was found untouched, unharmed, in the clothing that he had had on. He looked more asleep than dead. Okay, so Pliny the Elder goes towards the danger, and he's trying to observe it, but then eventually, of course, there are multiple ways of dying from a volcanic eruptions. One of those is obviously if you're hit by the lava, or you're hit by some of the rocks that are flying up in the air. But also there are some gases that are deadly that are circulating, and it seems that was what led to the death of Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Younger also described his own behavior and what he himself saw, although he was much further away from the eruption. And I look back, a dense cloud looms behind us, following us like a flood poured across the land. A darkness came that was not like a moonless or cloudy night, but more like the black of closed and unlighted rooms. You could hear women lamenting, children crying, men shouting. Some were calling for parents, other for children or spouses. They could only recognize them by their voices, right? It's dark. Some bemoaned their own lot, other that of their near and dear. There were some so afraid of death that they prayed for death. Many raised their hands to the god, and even more believed that there were no gods any longer, and this was one last unending night for the world. Nor were we without people who magnified real dangers with fictitious horrors. Some announced that one or another part of Misenum had collapsed or burned. Lies, but they found believers. It grew lighter, though that seemed not the return of day, but a sign that the fire was approaching. The fire itself actually stopped some distance away, but darkness and ashes came again, a great weight of them. I might boast that no groan escaped me in such perils, no cowardly word, but that I believed that I was perishing with the world and the world with me, which was a great consolation for death, right? So it was a pretty scary time for most everybody. And I think we want to be respectful of that as we explore the town and what remains, how many people died. The guide to your video is going to be Mary Beard, the author of SPQR, the book we have been using for the course. And she also wrote a book on Pompeii that you're not reading now, but she calls it the Pompeii Paradox, which references this idea that we both know a huge amount and very little about ancient life there. So partially, imagine we could just get a snapshot of all of our streets today, something essentially all non-living matter. But at the same time, would that describe, how our lives are today? If you cannot have people tell you how they are living, if you are just not really able to experience life when it's active, right? And so she said in that book that what we should see in Pompeii is not a scene from everyday life, but rather a place that was already well on its way to becoming a ghost town, right? So the point is, people were fleeing. And so we shouldn't quite imagine that we are seeing exactly a day in the life of. And I think the other thing she's cautioning us against, and this is also good for us as we are putting on our thinking hats, as we try to understand what we can and cannot learn from the town, is that Pompeii became an incredibly famous site as it started to be excavated especially in the second half of the 19th century. And the excavators often were very invested in making it look super interesting. So they sometimes did touch-ups, whether that was on wall paintings or on, just sort of decoration. And the point that matters to us about it is that sometimes they were going more for the fantastic or incredibly beautiful or something very sparkly, instead of, trying to let us see the town as it really was. But so keeping that in mind, that maybe the earliest excavators were less intent on what would be our modern archaeological goals, which would be site preservation, trying to keep as many things as possible on site. As you will learn, quite a few things were removed once they were excavated. Some people actually were mainly excavating for finding, nice statues that they could then sell on the market. But what we do have, what we can study very well, is sort of structures of life in the city of Pompeii. And so, in fact, if we look at sort of a drawing of the town, we can see that different parts of the town are very well preserved. And so we are going to use this for the purpose of our course as a way to look at an ancient city and to understand what we can learn from archaeological evidence about an ancient city. So an aerial photograph of the Forum of Pompeii, which is helpful to think of as the center of town, just like the Forum in Rome was a center of town, shows us that, it did have a large public space that was the Forum, and it was surrounded by a number of civic buildings here, a meeting place, and various other buildings. Most importantly, there was a temple to Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, identified here as a Capitoline triad, the three gods from the Capitoline Hill, that dominated the Forum. And so when we think about what a town might look like that's allied with Rome, in a way, it's trying to copy certain aspects of Rome. And so right here, we can get an even better view of this large temple that dominated the landscape. And importantly, it's also helpful to point out that outside of Rome, the imperial cult already had its building in the first century in towns of Italy. So even though in Rome, we do not expect to see a temple to the imperial cult in the city, in the towns, we do. And so, for example, right here in number 3 was an imperial cult building very, very close to the temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. There were some other traditional temples like this one to Apollo here as well. So to get a photograph of what it sort of looks like now, this would be the temple of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva with Vesuvius in the background. And, obviously quite a bit was destroyed. One of the ways of thinking about it is to imagine that everything was probably at least 2-story high. And obviously we don't get those top floors. To help with the imagination, here is a reconstruction of what that temple might have looked like. Notice also the 2 arches on either side through which you would leave the Forum and able to proceed to the rest of the city. One other thing I would say about this reconstruction, though, is that this is such a nice open empty space, but in reality, probably this was crowded with statues of famous people, who earned themselves the right to have their statues displayed there. We know this became very, very popular in the first century of the Roman Empire, and sometimes people distributed free food on certain days at a statue. So people were really trying to become famous that way. This is looking off one side. It's just helpful to see sort of some of these statue bases as they are preserved. Probably some of them are actually in the place where they were in the ancient world. So there was also on adjacent to the Forum a basilica, which in the ancient world just means a law court, maybe something like notary services. And the inside of it on this reconstruction gives us some sense of how beautiful and elaborate the decoration may have been in these places, even though much of that does not survive, obviously, today. Representationally, we should also be mindful of, the kind of same sacrificial imagery that we see of the emperor in Rome appears here also. So does the civic crown that was associated with the emperors. So in addition to the forum, there were some other large-scale structures. Here is a large sports field, which actually had a swimming pool, and you can make it out how it's getting deeper from one end to the other. On the right here, you see Pompeii's amphitheater that was able to host gladiatorial games. One of the sites most visited in Pompeii today is a brothel, and maybe the one thing I would say about that is that I think the Romans were a little less prudish than modern Americans are about displaying sexual scenes. And if you watch that part of the video, you will be seeing some of that representation, some of those representations, and it's helpful for us to think about a certain kind of masculinity much more on display than maybe we are comfortable with in America today. Beyond that, public buildings also included baths, and you will see those in the video. And so what I wanted to focus on in the remaining few minutes is to look at individual buildings. So wealthier people usually try to have what is called a villa. This would be the front part of it. This is where you enter. There is a little water structure here a lot. And so you would move through into the more private parts of the house. So this is what a wealthy person's house might look like. I know it looks pretty good. But in reality, probably most of the people lived in something that's more similar to a tenement house. Obviously, because the upper floors often don't survive, it's harder for us to know what those look like. But the idea is that a small room would have hosted a whole family, and they wouldn't necessarily have had a lot of kitchen and bath facilities in those buildings. We do get a little bit of a sense of what houses sort of looked like, because we do sometimes have these house plans sort of surviving on marble, and also because in the excavation we can see inside these houses and what they looked like. So this is again would be a drawing of such a house, a larger villa, where you have that first more public part and then a more private part with usually a little garden, and people could sort of walk around there. And then and maybe one more interesting thing about this is that number one, there are two of them here, would probably be little shops that they might rent out, and then they would have their house behind it. Same here, you see this taverna. This is a slightly smaller house there. So again, some houses differ. They don't all have the same plan. And also because Pompeii survived for hundreds of years, some of the houses get really complicated as real estate sort of evolves over time. So, don't get too caught up on sort of one version being the only right one. But if we walk through the entrance, where sometimes we get such fun depictions as a mosaic dog, just in case you want to go in when you shouldn't, and you enter into these houses, you would first reach this sort of open space of the atrium with that little water feature and with some light coming in. And then you would move beyond further towards the back of the house. Sometimes it's called a tablinum, or a study where members of the household might be able to receive guests. And then in the back, we would reach this peristyle where people could walk around like these fake ancient people. And then sometimes in the peristyle, we also find a lararium where the household gods would have been preserved. And so this is actually a surviving one. Some of these are really quite beautiful. One other room worth mentioning in these houses is the triclinium, which is a dining room. And this is an odd look for a dining room in a modern world. But what the Romans do actually is that they eat reclining. So you would imagine some pillows on top of this, and people are reclining 3 here, 3 here, 3 here. with the seating very hierarchical, and then they would have sort of their food served to them by slaves in the middle. This one is also a really neat one because it had a big water feature that would, like, the water would sort of come down, then hide and come out further. So, people had their fancy dining rooms in the ancient world. And in addition to that, this one was, for example, a dining room. And one of the things that we know about this is that people's sort of views were very important from these dining rooms. So they really, put their dining rooms as a sort of very representational space for visitors to get excited about. Okay, the last bit in preparation for the video has to do with sort of dating of these houses. And this is just a very short introduction to this. But actually, on quite a few of the houses, some wall paintings survive, and that's quite beautiful, fascinating, and very educational for us. And so people have been distinguishing different periods of this with some, scholarly arguments about it, but there are a number of styles, 4 in total, that are often mentioned. So the first earliest decoration was sort of fake marble. This is not actually marble, but they paint it like it is. Then we have a more sort of what people consider realistic sort of scenery. And then in the third style, things get a little bit more abstract, and then it gets absolutely sort of framed and not realistic in the fourth style. So this is very helpful. As you can see, people have been able to date this by the decade. And so it gives us an insight into when exactly certain houses were built and how we should interpret their decorations. But the most important thing you take away when you are watching the video is just being curious about how people lived and how much of that we can reconstruct and how we can learn about that. So that's the biggest question to remember.